Good evening, everyone. I will first await a motion to leave non-public and to seal the minutes.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? None opposed. All right. We are on to the City Council work session, Monday, April 10th, 2023. I will state at the outset of this happy birthday to my wife, and I will have to leave just before 7 to go to dinner, which I made a mistake in voting for this and trying not to get divorced on the work session scheduled for her birthday. I want to assure members of the public that I will be watching the public comment, which I expect to be hearty, and thank you, Chairman Chelman, for joining us this evening for this discussion. So with that, we are going to have a presentation from the Planning Department staff. Is that going to be Peter? Is that going to be Nick? It's going to be Nick, and we're going to pass it over to Nick. And at the end of this, we will have public comment, and again, that will be at the end of the meeting. Take it away, Nick.
Thank you, Mayor. And again, Nick Recknell, the Principal Planner in the Planning Department. Maybe in the spirit of the Mayor's birthday arrangements, I'll give as quick an overview as I can as to how we got here. We were at the Planning Department, worked with the Land Use Committee at the request of the City Council for nearly, I think, 6 months in developing, maybe longer, developing this draft set of amendments. And then we came back to the City Council, and it was referred to the Planning Board for their review. And I believe we had 3 meetings at the Planning Board, including a pretty comprehensive work session in the middle of the 3 meetings. So we were there for 2 to 3 months to come up with what we have today, which may not be perfect, but I think most of the, if not all, the participants in that process, of which there were many, felt like this was a major step forward, again, as imperfect as it may be in some particular corners. So I just have a few slides to give everyone else an opportunity to catch up. There were 3 main goals. Maybe this could go up on this. Is that me that has to put it on the screen? I'm a novice. All right.
Do file or view full screen.
Here?
Just no top bar, top view. Yep, full screen. Scroll down.
Full screen.
There you go.
Okay. So why are we doing this? 3 main reasons. First and foremost, there's a real desire to remove some of the barriers of the ability of property owners in Portsmouth to request an accessory dwelling unit on their property. And the 2 sort of primary changes we've made of many are reducing the lot area requirements, which right now is a pretty significant impediment for many of the traditionally designed neighborhoods in Portsmouth that don't have enough lot area to double it for 2 single-family structures, which is how the ordinance reads. We are talking in this set of amendments about removing that barrier, which I think is by far the most substantial change that will allow hundreds, if not many hundreds, of property owners to be able to apply for an ADU should this pass in its current form with respect to their lot area. There are a number of internal maybe inconsistencies in respect to the standards and the ability of the applicant, the neighbors, and the local boards and commissions to interpret some of the subordination requirements and architectural standards that are already in the existing ordinance. So there's a real attempt here to add clarity to that ambiguity or vagueness that currently exists. The second major goal is to strengthen the provisions for neighborhood compatibility. It's really about making sure, if we're going to open the spigot here and encourage more ADUs, that we effectively, as best we can, mitigate some of the privacy and adverse impacts that can come with sort of poorly designed ADUs in the backyards of an existing neighborhood. So we've really focused on those subordination and architectural design standards and tightening them up, providing more predictability on behalf of the neighborhood and the applicant, and less risk to the applicant that they're going to spend thousands of dollars pursuing an ADU only to end up discovering they haven't met the bar that currently is uncertain as to what a good architectural layout or the subordination requirements are unclear in the ordinance. So we've made a big effort to address that. The third main goal is obviously to make it easier to understand the ordinance itself. There's a lot of people that are confused in reading the existing ordinance. There's still a good number that are confused reading the proposed, but we do have a remedy for that, and once this is adopted, in whatever form it is adopted, we are developing an ADU handbook, which will be an illustrative book with elevations, floor plans, as well as site plans that demonstrate how you can come into compliance with these subordination and architectural design standards.
Can you put the mic closer to
Oh,
yourself?
sorry.
Thanks.
Yep.
Great.
So the slides are not this detailed, so don't be frightened. This is the only one with this much text on it. We've got changes to the table of uses in where you can apply for an ADU. We've gotten rid of the garden cottage language that's in the existing ordinance and folded that into a detached ADU. So we've tried to simplify the choices. You're either attached or detached, and there's a limited number of forms for each of those two. We've also introduced the idea of an administrative approval, sort of an as-of-right scenario where not every ADU has to go through a conditional use permit at the planning board. And in particular, we're interested in having, in this version, internal ADUs within existing structures where there's no exterior construction being allowed so-called as-of-right or through the administrative approval, as well as some smaller existing structures that meet all the existing setback requirements. We can get into that in the discussion. So again, it's about expanding opportunities for ADUs. We're looking at some applications in different districts, changing the density requirements with the lot area that I talked about earlier, and the as-of-right again, not everything being a conditional use permit that puts the applicant at risk. In terms of the standards, we've got the architectural design standards at the bottom of that 4-bulleted list, and we've got standards for ownership. These carry forward from the existing code out of the state statute. There are ownership requirements. The owner of the property needs to live in one of those 2 units should they put an ADU on their property. There's a bedroom limitation we've carried forward at 2 bedrooms, and there's a parking requirement that we have amended to lower that bar slightly from the existing condition. And then we've got a number of size and subordination standards for the attached units, which again is either inside an existing structure with no new construction to the building, no expansion, or it is an expansion or an addition to an existing single-family structure. So those are really the 2 types of attached ADUs. And then the detached is what you imagine it is. It's either taking an existing accessory structure that's already in existence on the site, which was formerly the garden cottage, and converting it into an ADU, or building a new detached ADU. And really, the privacy issues and the issue of subordination is most heightened with those detached ADUs. That I think we're trying to have them not compete with scale, mass, height, and volume with the principal structure that's already on the site. So there's a whole host of details in respect to the architectural design standards. Again, it's about consistency with the principal structure and the surrounding context, and building something in similar in appearance to the principal structure. It's not a mini-me, it's not a replica or a verbatim set of design standards that go from the principal to the accessory structure, but something that's consistent. We talked about the as-of-right versus the conditional use permit, and then we've got a post-approval requirement that's already in the code that requires the property owner annually to certify that they're meeting their obligations under the ADU. The additional piece to this amendment that we think will be more effective for long-term compliance and enforcement is requiring that an affidavit from the applicant prior to an occupancy permit being issued initially for the ADU, they'd be required to record an affidavit that they're in full acknowledgement of their obligations under the code. So again, 2 types of attached ADUs, up to 750 square feet of, we use gross living area. That'll probably come up in the discussion at the end, so I won't belabor it here. but we've moved from gross floor area to gross living area. It does make that 750 square feet a little bit larger than what it would be with a gross floor area. It's really about conditioned space and about the living area of the ADU rather than the thickness of the walls or the garage or storage areas. So again, we can talk about that later. But you're either within an existing single-family home, and we have that permitted in this version as of right in 7 different zoning districts, and we have 3 districts that still require a conditional use permit for that. Again, within an existing single-family dwelling. The second option is an addition or an alteration of up to 750 square feet. Attaching to an existing dwelling, and that is allowed in 9 districts with a conditional use permit. There are 3 types of detached ADUs. Again, these are separate from the main structure. They're either in an existing structure that complies with the code, which is the first one up there, and it's allowed as of right in this version in 5 zoning districts, and by conditional use permit in 2. Or you can convert an existing structure up to 600 square feet in gross living area into an ADU if you do not meet all the zoning requirements, which is often the case for these accessory buildings that have been on the property for 50 to 150, 200 years, and they're proposed to be ADUs. They're often in the rear or side yard setback. So this would still require a conditional use permit to convert one of those structures into a ADU. The last one at the bottom of the list is a new structure being constructed on the lot, and it would have to meet all the code requirements and would require a conditional use permit. So the one change we made during the planning board process after the 6 odd months at the land use committee, which does have a couple of planning board members on the land use committee and I believe 3 city councilors. We meet monthly, and we've worked on this for 6 or 8 months, and when we got in front of the planning board, there was a real desire to require less parking than up to 2 spaces. 750 square foot unit, if you went right to the ceiling, would require 1.5 spaces, which would round to 2. So an ADU, if it was the maximum size that's allowed, the 750, it would currently require 2 parking spaces. And what is specified in this amendment is we would reduce that to 1. So that's what's before us in this version. In terms of the subordination requirements, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these because there are probably a dozen. I'll wait for the questions, but there's a whole host of design concerns and subordination concerns, in particular with this slide. The whole idea of an ADU, especially when it's detached, and most particularly when it's detached, is it's a secondary structure. It's not intended to compete with the principal single-family structure that's on the lot. So that's why there's subordination requirements in the existing code. They just aren't well defined. And what we've tried to do here is say, okay, let's look at some examples, and not only of projects that have come forward, but look at our respective neighborhoods and make sure we're not faced with some of the prior situations I think the planning board's been confronted with, where the proposed detached ADU can sometimes be 3 or 4 times bigger than the principal structure that's on the lot in the existing code, because it's again vague as to how you treat conditioned space versus unconditioned, the garage, the storage, the stairs, something that's not heated. And I think the intent, at least we felt going through this for the 8 months with the Land Use Committee and the Planning Board and many members of the public that participated actively in that process, was that these buildings are, because they're in the rear yards most of the time of the principal structure, they're not intended to be houses behind houses. They're small houses. So they should be shorter, they should be smaller, they should be broken down so they're, again, not competing with the principal structure. And when you have a 750 square foot cap and 2 bedrooms, there's no need to build a 3,000 or 4,000 square foot accessory structure with an ADU inside it, at least through this permitting process. That's the approach we took. So there's a lot of new numbers that we put in here. They aren't perfect, but they're intended to at least prevent bad things from happening. It won't guarantee perfection, but it should lead us to a better outcome than some of the applications we've seen in the last 5 years. So in respect to the detached ADUs, we have the 750 square foot, again, GLA, which is about 825 square feet of GFA. we can talk about that after, when I'm done here, if that's confusing, which I'm sure it might be. We're using the same application for expansion of existing accessory buildings that are already on the property. And the 1,600 square foot is just another number again, or 75% of the principal building's gross floor area, to prevent something massive being built behind an existing single-family structure. If we went back a couple of hundred years, we would see big house, a farmhouse, a connecting house and a big barn, but that's the only time you see something really large in a rural setting get placed behind a principal structure and it be appropriate. That's not the land use pattern of Portsmouth in the 21st century, to build a very large barn behind your house. But we're trying to minimize the potential of somebody building a very large structure with an ADU in it in their backyard through this process. So there's a whole host of these standards, step backs, height, how do we deal with single-story buildings? That's in here. Ranches, newer neighborhoods. How do you put an addition or an alteration on an existing ranch building? That's specified. How do you add a detached unit? There's provisions for that. There's controls over the footprint, the volume. The dormer piece is about privacy, and this only affects an existing structure that's in the side or rear yard setback next to their neighbor, closer than they would normally be allowed if they just built the structure. It's an opportunity to, again, try and find the delta between the privacy concerns of the abutter who's already there and the new resident that's going to move in, and provide some light and air without it being overly burdensome to the existing neighbor. Again, for a structure that's in the setbacks already. There's a reference, sort of belt and suspenders, to the drainage requirements that are already in the code. And then we've got the building separation, which has been reduced here to reflect more the building code requirements than forcing somebody to create what's now required. I think it's 20 feet between the detached ADU and the main house. They may still do 20 feet, but they're not required to start at 20 feet in this set of amendments. The architectural design standards, again, these are sort of the headers, the massing, the style, the roof forms, again, not looking for duplication, but consistency. And the image that I've shown there is an application that did come before the planning board. I don't think it continued, but that would be an example of something that would clearly meet these standards. But again, it doesn't have to be a verbatim extension of what's there. When you're talking about copper gutters or slate roofs, that is not what, and the planning board spent time on this to make sure that it couldn't be interpreted that way. So I think we found the language to make that clear. And I talked about the affidavit a little bit earlier. We've got a proposal to have that recordable affidavit that speaks to the obligations of ownership and owner occupancy for the owner. So the next steps, and I'm done here with this slide, is really to get through this amendment process, have them adopted, then get the handbook written, and create examples, flowcharts of how this permitting process works for your respective type of ADU, and have it be illustrative in respect to site plans, elevation, and floor plans. Make it easier on folks so they're not looking at $20,000, $30,000 of upfront costs. They're welcome to do that if they've got a really innovative idea and want to do something different maybe than what's around them. They would be able to do that. But we're going to try in this handbook to provide really detailed examples that people could use to apply for the ADU, and in particular the detached. And we're going to track this data better moving forward. It took us a good amount of time to pull together. We've had 37 applications and only 15 have made it out to occupancy. I can't tell you how many are in the process of working towards it, but it probably isn't too many. So a lot of people have not made it through the existing process, and hopefully this is going to make it easier. That's the goal here, but not so easy. There isn't a process. So.
Thank you, Nick. Attorney McCourt, anything on the legal front and recommendations before we open it up to the discussion?
Yes, Mayor, thank you. So I'd just like to start by setting the table a little bit for what the legal department was intending to do here with these proposed amendments, and that's As we know, in New Hampshire, there's, the cities and municipalities only have those powers and duties that have been conferred upon them by the state. And there are a few statutes on ADUs, which give us our powers and responsibilities there. And what that creates is kind of a scale from the most restrictive at one end and the least restrictive on the other. And what Nick has laid out and done a good job of laying out is where we are on that scale currently and where this proposal is taking us, and also how we got to this proposal. And what the legal department's limited review was to mix my metaphors here a little bit, is to identify those portions of this proposed ordinance that are outside of the window provided to us by the state. And those proposed changes are very minimal, and then we, in that process, we've also proposed a few changes that will help clarify the process, help any decision made by any administrative official or board, land use board in the city, more defensible if appealed. And there are also a few housekeeping edits that the legal department proposed. And then, so just to walk through those, state statute does allow municipality to set a maximum size for ADUs, but they cap that at 750 square feet. So the first proposal is within the table, section 1.222, where the ordinance references detached ADUs within an existing building which is non-conforming to the zoning ordinance. That sets the cap at the gross living area at 600 square feet, so the legal department would propose to change that to 750 square feet. Or to at least change it to 750 square feet. And I understand that there could be multiple ways to accomplish that goal. Speaking with Chairman Chalman, he proposed a different structure where within the two residential districts, ADUs up to 600 square feet would be available by administrative approval, and then between 600 square feet and 750 square feet, that would require a conditional use permit. That would be a permissible alternative as well. And I believe Mr. Cracknell also has a different proposal in mind as well. But there are multiple ways to do that, but I guess just to keep everything in compliance with state statute, I wouldn't want to restrict any ADUs in any particular district to a size, to a maximum size less than 750 square feet.
Gross floor area.
I'm sorry?
Gross floor area.
Gross floor area, exactly. Thank you. Moving along. So I will say that the proposed changes to sections 10.814.434 and .435 were intended to encompass that same statutory restriction. But as it has since been explained to me by Mr. Cracknell, I was confused about the footprint of a building that would contain an ADU, and I didn't understand how you could have a footprint that's smaller than 750 square feet and still have an ADU within that building that is up to 750 square feet. But as it was explained to me, it can have multiple floors. It could have a first floor and then an attic space, which would add, or not an attic, or a second floor, which would add to that square footage. So we would withdraw that change. Section 10.814.22 was just a suggestion to remove duplicative language. And then at section 10.814.40, I suggest adding a line or two at the beginning of that section, just to make it clear that those standards are intended to ensure the aesthetic continuity with the principal dwelling unit. It was unclear from reading what that section was meant to accomplish, and I just wanted it to be very clear for everyone applying it what the purpose of that was. Within the review and approval process contained in Chapter 10.814.60, there are a few changes proposed there, which all go to making it clear when the time periods start. This is that review process done by the administrative official, the planning director, and there has to be notice sent out to abutters and then a 30-day comment period and posting of a sign. And the edits proposed in there were just to make it clear when that time period starts and when it ends, so that there's no question later on when attempting to apply it. The proposed change, moving in that same section, 814.613, the proposed change there is just to give clear options for the administrative official applying that section, the planning director, allowing that planning director to approve, deny, request additional information from the applicant, or in appropriate circumstances, and only in appropriate circumstances, to refer that to the planning board for a conditional use permit. And the only situation where the planning director would refer that to the planning board would be if the applicant is requesting modifications, which are contemplated under another section of the ordinance, modifications to the standards, such as removal of a parking spot, for example. Any other, if it's not permitted though there, then the appropriate response would be to deny it, and then any appeals of that decision would go to the Board of Adjustment and not to the planning board. I guess that's how the statute is laid out. Finally, there was one or maybe two other sections later on where it looks like garden cottage hadn't been removed from a definition, and because this proposal would eliminate the garden cottage section, the legal department would recommend that those references be eliminated. And like I said, the legal department's scope of review is pretty limited, and that is all we came up with.
Thank you, Attorney McCourt. Now open it up to discussion. Any questions from the council? Councilor Bagley.
Thank you, Your Honor. So my understanding is the RSA, which allows for ADUs in 2017, could be enacted as a city with no changes or modifications whatsoever. So in theory, if we didn't pass what we passed earlier, or if we eliminated everything, it would just default back to that state RSA.
Yes, that is broadly true. It actually contains a default provision. If the city does not have to enact any ADU ordinance, and the RSA contemplates that and provides a default state for ADUs.
Okay, so there's two questions I have. Is the aesthetic provisions are not required by the statute. We could move forward with no aesthetic provisions. However, by the way the RSA is written, if we do move forward with aesthetic provisions, it is in relationship to the existing house, not the neighborhood.
That's correct, yes. The default rule would be that every single-family dwelling in the city would be entitled to one ADU, and they would be subject only to a building permit.
Okay, and then the question I have on parking is if we require any parking with the ADU, and somebody submits for an ADU and they have a house that's existing with no off-street parking, that would trigger the bring up to code clause where they would now need to have at least 3 spaces if they had no existing off-street parking and their main dwelling required 2 spaces and the ADU required 1 space.
If you have a legal pre-existing non-conforming use at your property, you're entitled to maintain that use. But if you propose to expand that use at all, you have to bring that into compliance with the zoning ordinance. So yes.
So if we didn't want to trigger that, the solution would be not to require parking with ADUs because we would not be changing the existing use because we weren't requiring any additional parking.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Tabor.
Thanks, Your Honor. Question about administrative approval versus conditional use permits. I would want us to be able to have simple administrative approval by right wherever we can. And with that kind of philosophy, I'm looking at the use table where we have the smaller ADU, the 600, and I understand we should have 750 by state statute, but 1.221 and 1.223 are instances where we have detached ADUs that meet all the requirements, complies with all the lot and building dimensional standards, but those require conditional use permits, with the exception of the 600 square foot in GRA and GRB and GRC. Why wouldn't we just have, if it conforms, it's a detached ADU, it conforms to everything in this ordinance, why wouldn't it have administrative approval by right? Why does the applicant have to go through the extensive public hearings? Because of course the people who show up at the public hearings are those who don't want that backyard to change in any way, and the people who never show up are the people who need the housing.
Let me take a stab at that.
Well, it's not a legal question, Nick, so feel free to,
All right.
it's a policy question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, not answering for all the people that have participated on this effort, number one, I think there's a desire to provide adequate notice, number one, to a neighborhood and a set of abutters, just as a baseline level of, maybe not the right word, respect for the folks that live in that particular neighborhood, especially when you're looking at conversion of existing accessory structures, which are generally the most dormant buildings in the city, right? You're moving from a tomb with nothing happening but a lawnmower maybe coming out once in a while to an active use with lights, potentially balconies, patios, and they tend to be, again, not in the front yard. They end up being in the back. And many neighborhoods in Portsmouth, as we all know, have very shallow front yards, shallow side yards, and if you lose on both of those, you generally have something for a rear yard to make it a livable place to be. And that's where these things typically occur, is in the rear. And I think, again, it's not an acknowledgement that it can't be done. It's an acknowledgement that out of an abundance of respect for the people that are there, and I have been to meetings where people show up in support of their neighbors trying to do these ADUs. So I think we generally want to hear from as many people as we can, and I think we all agree with that. But it's really about discretionary determination of these subordination and architectural design standards, which they're not cookie cutter, they're not clear cut. We're attempting to make them as clear as possible with all the diversity of land use patterns and neighborhoods and architectural styles in Portsmouth. This isn't form-based coding yet. So until we get to form-based coding, which I'm not advocating we're working on, but it could be done, it's tough to get to an as-of-right situation till you really address the diversity of situations you can be confronted with as a practitioner signing off with no notice to abutters.
Thanks.
Chairman Chellman.
There's one other point that this came up, Councilor Tabor. The two left columns in three of the zones, you're currently not allowed to have two-family dwellings. So the thought was by adding another dwelling on a property that's presently only allowed to have one dwelling, that's why we thought a conditional use permit might be appropriate.
Councilor Moreau.
There was also a lot of pushback from the public to make sure that if you were going to build something new, that you had a public hearing so that people could be heard. And we got months of feedback.
Yes, and our intern Lucas, I think, summarized a lot of that input
Yeah.
for us, which was, and the privacy concerns and light concerns are valid.
Counselor Begg.
Yeah, thank you, Your Honor. And for clarification, if we did not have these aesthetic requirements, it would be much easier to provide administrative approval. That being said, if the ADU was in the historic district, would the HDC still supersede that?
Correct.
So if we did this without aesthetic requirements, it would not change the look and feel of the HDC neighborhoods.
I don't believe so.
Thank you.
So just on that point of it being easier to do so, it would be easier to do so, at least in my opinion, in a administrative, legal way. I think it would be harder for it to be easier to do so in terms of a neighbor reaction way. We live in Portsmouth, and for better or worse, a sport of ours is telling other people what to do with their property. And our code book has grown about 40 pages. It's a pretty intensive code book. What I like about the standards and being unified in the standards is I believe maybe in the opposite, that allows us to have some administrative approval. I don't think there would be a planner on planet Earth, and certainly not in Portsmouth, that would say, yes, I'm going to approve this without having some design guides to say this aligns with this, this, and this, and so I'm going to approve it based on a right. So I believe that if we're trying to get to a place where we will have administrative approvals, and that's my goal, is to have some of these approved administratively so we can move past 15, and 37 applicants. It's not going to be perfect by any stretch, but I think if we take away some of those design guidelines, it's going to be harder for I don't think our planning staff is going to go out on too many limbs to say, you know what, this judgment call is mine to make if this happens or not. That's a hard thing, at least in my opinion, for the planning staff to be able to make that call administratively. But if we can agree, and it's the planning board, it's the land use, the city council, that we're looking at some standards that we can point to and say, yeah, this is something that we could support, and administratively, in these circumstances, we can get behind this, then I think we can have some administrative approvals and avoidance of having to go through the land use committee. Councilor Cook, first bite at the apple. Councilor Blaylock, then Councilor Lombardi.
Thank you, Mayor. I just have a question about the table of uses. The first thing in the table is single-family dwelling, and there's a change in CD5, CD4 from permitted to not permitted for single-family dwelling. And I'm curious how that arose, and I have a question about single-family residential that is grandfathered in those areas. If they have a fire and lose their home, what happens?
I can take that, I think. So the first question is, why are we prohibiting in this amendment single-family structures in the CD4 and CD5? Well, the CD4 and CD5 are essentially downtown Portsmouth. Right. And the zoning, we have a conflict in the code today. You can't actually build a single-family structure using the form-based code in Portsmouth downtown today, even if you had the land. So this is bringing the ADU ordinance into conformance with the existing form-based coding for the first answer to the first question. Okay. The second one is if a fire exists and you happen to have a single-family structure in the downtown and it's a non-conforming structure, you have a year to put it back. You're grandfathered, you're vested for a year to pull a building permit. If you don't do it within a year, you have to come into compliance with the current zoning code.
And can I just make a suggestion that we look at that later, because a year is a very short period of time today with the building requirements. I know it's, even if it's state rules, we should be looking at that before we go changing the code there.
Yeah, so we're not changing anything here that affects that. What we're changing here is you can't do a new single-family structure today. All we're doing is making this code consistent with the form-based code that's already in the downtown. We missed that when we adopted the form-based coding. We missed in 2017 that this was written the way it was.
Councilor Blaylock.
Thank you, Your Honor. And yeah, I just want to thank all the hard work that's been put on this. Land Use Committee, we've been working on this for 8 months now. And I will say all our efforts to try to make obviously, this easier for the resident, for the homeowner, for the potential ADU builder. But with that same balance, we have to make sure that we don't create, circumstances that were not intended. We did hear from the public a lot that getting noticed on projects like this was very important to them. Unfortunately, Portsmouth, back when my grandparents moved here, my father was little, the whole neighborhood would hang out every weekend. Everyone knew everyone else's business. There was block parties every weekend. I think now, unfortunately, we don't communicate as much as we used to as neighbors. So residents do like hearing about when their neighbor is doing a building, and they do like the chance to speak. So we're very careful about taking those away. But I do want to do everything we can to make these easier to build, obviously, and creating more housing in Portsmouth. But I just want to explain that that was a big balance that we've been working on over the last 8 months.
Thank you, Councilman Barty.
I think maybe this was answered, but I just saw virtually no references to overlay districts as in general on this, other than the downtown overlay. Is all those requirements still exist in the overlay districts, I presume?
The overlay districts are unaffected by this. Yeah.
Councilor Moreau. Councilor Cook, do you have your hand up?
I do.
Okay, Councilor Moreau and Councilor Cook.
I just wanted to add to the conversation when we were talking about the aesthetics look. Let's keep in mind that the original statute and the way this was all created under the state was that they wanted to take single-family neighborhoods and add density without it looking like you're adding density, right? So all of those requirements to have it look similar, to look like it's part of the principal structure, was to make it not look like it's a second dwelling unit. We were trying to make it look like you're still driving down the street and it still looks like it's a bunch of single-family homes. So it might seem onerous, but the mayor is absolutely correct. You don't want a planning director having no guidelines when they're actually looking at an application. You want them to be able to have those guidelines, to be able to make sure that when they are administratively approving something, it's based off of what the city council has set into the ordinance. And without those, I think they would have a hard time approving anything because they wouldn't have any guidelines basically to do that. So that's where all those things come in.
Councilor Cook.
Thank you, Mayor. Was there any consideration given to creating a time limit for consideration for conditional use, that it reverts to administrative approval after a certain period of time? I raise this because I think that one of the reasons that the process is so onerous for individuals applying for not just ADUs but several things through our planning and zoning is that it takes a long period of time to get through that process, and because it takes such a long period of time, it costs them a lot more money in legal fees. Was there any consideration of that? It was suggested to me by someone who is a former planner that there's a time limit on consideration.
Well, I'll take a stab at that because there's an easy answer to the first part. No, I'm not sure how you would do something like that, so I'll leave that to the legal folks. But I just want to say, I think it's really helpful, and it has been to me, and I think a lot of us on the Land Use Committee, to focus maybe less on the type of permit and the procedural requirements in trying to reduce barriers, than recognize what I think we've found looking at the code itself and the applicants that have come before us. The real barriers to ADUs isn't a conditional use permit. It's the lot area requirements that disqualify probably half the property owners in Portsmouth from being able to even ask without a variance. A Board of Adjustment application is a whole different can of worms, right? And it's what we're trying to avoid. But the lack of clarity in the subordination requirements and the architectural design standards are creating sometimes disastrous outcomes that put the planning board on the defense to very creative applicants trying to do something that the ordinance was never intended to do. And I think the timing factor of how long you're kicking around the planning board is largely related to the ambiguity of the existing code, not the fact that you're at the planning board. They do a good job, but they can only do as good a job as the ordinance equips them to do. And I think that's what That's where we're really placing our emphasis. And maybe we're wrong, but we won't know till we actually try it. Removing the substantive barriers should really open opportunities for ADUs without trying to focus too hard on an as-of-right solution, because that's a lot harder to solve, to get your code to produce predictable results, so no one has to be notified of a meeting or a hearing or a review of an application. That's really hard. And that's, to me, the last line of defense. The first is, let's get the code, let's equip the planning board with the best language we can, so when homeowners hire design professionals, it's not wide open for either abuse or overly creative designs that, again, put the planning board as volunteers in the community in a really awkward position where they don't want to say no. And sometimes they're approving things that are just not in the interest of the neighborhood or the city. At least that's what I think happens occasionally. So.
Thank you, Nick. I'm going to have to pass the gavel to Councilor Tabor, as I do want to stay married and have dinner with my wife on her birthday. I will say, if allowed, the time that I do appreciate all the effort that has gone into it. I think that 15 units built over however many years since then Senator Martha Fuller Clark went against the New Hampshire Municipal Association, went against our own views as a city in having an edict from the state put on us to say that we have to do something. I agree that we have to do something on this because the issue is important. I hope that this issue can get to a point where we are solving both an affordability issue for people that want to stay on their properties, as well as creating an opportunity to have more neighbors. I think that we as a council have to recognize that some of the biggest issues we face are parking, and neighborhood feel of people that have moved to this neighborhood or grew up here, and having that taken into account. This is not perfect by any standards, but any ordinance that is only produced, 2 units a year, give or take, is not meeting its intended consequence. And I hope that we look at the good instead of the perfect, which might be a little more elusive, given the fact that we are men and women governing men and women, and we are limited in our ability to do that with, I guess, perfect information. So I appreciate everybody, and again, I'm sorry I'll be watching the comments this evening.
Yes, Councilor Morrow.
I just wanted to say thank you to Attorney Court on the 750 footprint, and maybe in order to make that clear moving forward, do we need to add 4 multi-level structures? I mean, or can we leave it the way it is based off of, that's what the intent was, right? Is that somebody might build a garage and then want to build something over it, and we're trying to keep that into a minimal footprint depending on how many stories they built.
Sure. I mean, you could do that in a couple different ways. You could add something to the ordinance itself to make it a little more clear. I think also the handbook that the planning department is developing could, you could certainly put that in there. That would be a nice place to put that, just to make it clear to anybody what options are available.
Councilor Bagley?
Yeah, thank you, Your Honor. Just a technical question, because it's been brought up a few times now.
He left.
With the aesthetic standards, the pushback I'm hearing is if we don't have any, we can't do approval by right because somebody in the planning department is probably not going to want to approve it. However, if there is no aesthetic standards, on what grounds would they not approve a project? I guess that part I don't quite understand.
Okay, so I guess from a legal perspective, you don't have to have aesthetic standards, and if you don't, then there's no reason to deny it for its aesthetics. But if you do have aesthetic standards, my recommendation would be you do have specific items, such as those listed in the proposed amendments, to provide more predictability and reliability for people who are seeking to add an ADU to their property. It gives the administrative official a clear checklist to work through, and it provides somebody, okay, I know if I design this thing looking like this, I have a very high likelihood of getting it approved. Therefore, it's a worthy investment.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is either no standards at all, because then it's easy, because there's nothing to deny, or extensive standards, so there's a checklist for the applicant to follow and for the planning department to verify, so to
Well,
speak.
they don't need to be, I mean, they could be extensive, certainly. They don't need to be. They just need to be clear.
Okay. So I guess the follow-up would be, we either have none at all, or we have clear, concise ones.
That's correct.
Councilor Blaylock and then Councilor Moreau.
Thank you. And I'll just repeat the goal, and I'm glad to hear the planning department is still using on the ADU handbook. The goal was to make it easy, like the checklist. So I want to build an ADU. I want to check off these 10 boxes, and then through the guidebook or the handbook, you would then have maybe 2 or 3 options that you could build in your backyard. That would eliminate a lot of time, a lot of planning. I think we've heard it costs something upward of $20,000 or $40,000 just to apply right now. Obviously, that's what we want to eliminate, that cost. But not having any rules whatsoever where someone could just put up 4 walls, I don't think that's the answer that we're going to either. You know, so there's that balance of, but that the easy part in making it accessible for everyone, I know we don't have the handbook yet, so it's hard to, I can't show you and we can't look at it. But we're getting closer to there, and that's, when we get there, I really think that is the goal. That's what at least in my eyes.
In addition, to add to that, the design standards make every project more legally defensible. So it's going to really help in the long run, because if you have no design standards, then, and every neighbor of every project gets upset, there's going to be a lot of things going to the ZBA on appeal, but there's not going to be any guidelines to tell them whether or not what one side says or the other side said is right. So if we're giving really, distinct, this is what we consider being the same or similar or whatever, then they have something to work off of, and it does make it more legally defensible, which means there hopefully will be less appeals.
Councilor Cook, did you?
I have a question around parking again. Councilor Bagley raised this earlier. What do you do when you have the majority of a neighborhood that's non-conforming when it comes to parking? And I happen to live in one of these neighborhoods. And so you're in a situation where it would be hard to identify a house that would qualify for an ADU. Even if there's space within the home to add an ADU, there's not parking availability. Yet, a huge number of people who live in the neighborhood do not have off-street parking. So essentially, you're telling one home, because they're grandfathered, that they don't have to have off-street parking, but you're telling another that they would have to have off-street parking. How do we reconcile that?
Nick said he would.
Let's go for Nick and then Rick.
Oh, do you want to go? Go ahead, Rick.
The conditional use permit does allow the planning board to waive the parking requirement. So if you couldn't provide parking, that would be the way to go. Apply for a conditional use permit.
That would have been my answer.
Right.
Mine as well.
Yeah. And Nick, you wanted to say something?
I did. I wanted to, could I just jump back to the design question that was raised earlier and then reiterated? Because I think I misspoke, and I've done that before. I think the design standards that we're talking about, and the subordination standards that are in this ordinance, are of great help to the HDC. The HDC has about a 120-page set of design guidelines for the historic district, which is somewhere around 1,200 properties are affected by it. There is no chapter on ADUs in that 12-chapter set of design guidelines, because ADUs didn't exist at the time we put that together. These subordination requirements that are largely quantitative, and the architectural standards which are largely qualitative, essentially, in my mind, with the baseball diamond analogy, put both the planning board and the HDC and the applicant and their design team somewhere between second and third base, depending on how robust you think these are, in terms of the predictability of scoring that point, scoring that run. And the absence of those standards, you're probably in the batter's box swinging. You're not on first base. You don't have a clue. Obviously, if they're not required in the ordinance, you're not generally talking about them. But as I think we've discussed in prior conversations, if you have a public process, I'm convinced, doing this for 30 years, design of a building and a site, and not the utilities, not the parking, not the lighting, not the drainage. That's what you hear from one public meeting after another, because every city and town has those requirements, and they are the grab bag. Few communities have the design standards that actually get to the problem that most people have with the applicant, with the application before them. And I think I think we need these standards, and I think they help the Historic Commission as much as they help the Planning Board, because again, and they help the applicant. That's they help the property owner get closer to third base than standing out at first base wondering if they're safe or not, because right now it's ambiguous. And it seems unlikely that the citizens of Portsmouth that have participated to date would ever envision an ADU ordinance in the absence of architectural design standards or subordination requirements. So.
Counselor Bagley.
Thank you for that, and I will concede that I will probably lose the point on the design standards, and I would prefer to win or find some relief on the parking. We have a situation now where if somebody wanted to build an ADU and they had no off-street parking, they would build their ADU, potentially trigger the requirement for 3 parking spaces, and now not only are they building an ADU on their lot, they're getting rid of their garden and their lawn to put a driveway that parks 3 cars. I don't see how that's advantageous to anybody in the community. But on a further note, this is a nationwide problem. It's not a New Hampshire problem or a Portsmouth problem, but we have an affordable housing crisis. We have very few tools in the toolbox to address it. The ADU ordinance, where the owner has to live either in the principal dwelling unit or in the ADU, is going to ensure that when somebody builds and designs this, they're building and designing their home. They're going to design that to a good level. There's a safety valve there. These are not investment properties. The other things that we have to think about, as important as talking about HDC standards or aesthetic standards are, we have city employees that are living in vans. We have hospital wait times because we don't have enough doctors and nurses. We can't find electricians. We can't find builders. Schools are having a hard time finding teachers. My daughter has an IEP. She's been unable to get a tutor for 2 years. She's been unable to get the help that she needs because we can't hire people in the community because there's not places for these people to live. So while I appreciate there's a historic character to our neighborhoods, we have a tool here with ADUs that the better and more streamlined we make it, where we can get more than 2 a year, the better our community is going to be. And there may be a slight degradation in the aesthetic look of our neighborhoods, but we're talking about people's homes, and I think that should be the priority.
Counselor Denton.
Having been on the council 7 years ago that first went through this process and passed the ordinance went through numerous work sessions, and I was left back then confused by what a garden cottage was, so thank you for removing that. I'm disappointed to see it only yielded on average 2 a year, so any changes that could be made to yield 3 or more a year would be greatly appreciated.
I'm going to pass the gavel.
Councilor Tabor.
I asked a local architect to take a look at the current form because she and others had input way back in the process. And I said, what could we do to make there be less friction? And she said one of the hang-ups for her was the connecting door and the ADU that's attached. That comes with a fire code rating that gets very expensive. And what would be the need for that? And I noticed in best practices around the country for ADUs, they're dropping that requirement in many cities. So I'll ask that question.
It's requirement.
Yeah, that is required by state statute.
Yeah.
Okay. We don't have any wiggle room on
No
that.
choice on that.
Yeah, we have no room.
But we know what to do now.
So it's now clear for everybody who wants to do this. And also, there's language in the directing the planning board in approving one of these to say that the ADU is compatible with the character of the neighborhood and maintains privacy of the neighborhood. Sounds great, but that to me, if I were an applicant, knowing that there people would come out with those concerns, I would say, what's the standard? I mean, that language just seems so open-ended.
So, can I speak?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my answer to that would be the existing code does not give somebody a good answer as to what that is. The proposed code, again, is imperfect, but it answers many of those privacy-related concerns. If your building, for example, is in the side yard setback, not where it's supposed to be, you can't have dormers on that side of the roof. You can't have a balcony. You can't have doors and windows above 8 feet if you're in someone's side yard. So privacy is really, you can say it's subjective, but there's some objective standards that are in this code that's before you that should make that an easier answer to generate. And at the end of the day, this is, at the end of the day, about reasonable people being reasonable, meaning the decision makers, the people that are appointed to this board. And I think this is going to, and we obviously went there and took this language through the planning board. I'd hazard to guess, I'm guessing they would feel this is going to equip them better to answer that question. I'll let the chairman maybe shoot me down or agree. This is imperfect, but I think those findings, which are always general at the end of a decision, what's compatible, what's consistent, they're anchored as best as possible in the standards that are provided, which I think are far more robust in what's before you than what we have today. Rick, do you have anything to add?
Would you like me to? Yes. Well, one of the sections you referenced about privacy, it talks about the proposal not significantly reducing the privacy of adjacent properties. So if we have an application before us, as we have had, where somebody's proposing, say, a giant window right in an existing building close to their neighbor's property line, at an elevation that looks down on the neighbor's property, that could be intrusive. And there's no mechanism currently where we could say, well, that giant window maybe ought to be 2 smaller windows, perhaps, and maybe not go all the way to the floor, or otherwise be less intrusive on your neighbor. It is subjective, it's not objective, but making a complete objective list would, I think, greatly concern Councilor Bagley, and it would concern me as a designer because it would get very burdensome. There has to be some discretion for, and to hear from the neighbors how they interact with their existing properties. That's very helpful.
Councilor Cook, thank you.
To follow up on that question, in my neighborhood, the South End, then, how would you ever approve any ADU if we're talking about privacy? And I ask this question because I'm abutted by, let's see, 3, 4, 5 properties.
Mm-hmm.
One of my direct abutters has 3 decks that directly overlook my backyard. The neighbor behind me is 5 apartments. That neighbor's 3 condos. Then there are 3 single families, one with no parking. How, in all of those cases, everyone can see into my yard, into my house, and I think that that's the case for most people in my neighborhood. So how could you meet this standard of privacy, say, in my neighborhood? Wouldn't you just be automatically ruling out ADUs for that neighborhood?
I've got it. It's contextual. In your neighborhood, the context is different than it would be in other parts of the city. If you're talking about 2-acre lots, and that context has a certain level of privacy that's expected and pre-existing. In your neighborhood, you have a different type of privacy that's pre-existing and contextual with your neighborhood. So if what the neighbor is proposing to do significantly decreases that, that's something for the board that we would consider. But if it's pretty much maintaining the same status quo that you already, because that's why you live there. One of the reasons you live there, because of the context and the character of that neighborhood. That neighborhood is different. It would be treated differently than somewhere else. Now, to quantify that would require, how many zones do we have? How many different neighborhoods do we have? How many lot sizes do we have? It would be a huge table. I think this language gives the reasonable discretion to do that and to address exactly what you're saying.
Yes, Nick.
Which underscores why an as-of-right pursuit is so challenging. That's a great answer. It's a correct answer. The impact on privacy is calibrated to context. And that's why it's near impossible to write a code that's going to avoid a public process just for avoidance, just for speeding up something. You need to have that case-by-case review to get it right.
Other questions as we get closer to public comment? Councilor Bagley.
Just a couple technical questions. Generally speaking, when we build in dense neighborhoods, the cost to the city is less because the sewers, the infrastructure has to be extended less, so to speak. So if you had more homes per, say, unit of length per mile, the overall tax burden for the city as a whole would be less versus if we had 5 homes per mile versus, say, 15 or 20 homes per mile.
So, yes?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. That would be true if your non-urban example was new construction. Where infrastructure exists, there's typically never going to be a case where an ADU is going to require an upgrade to a water or sewer main. So you're right. There's an economies of scale of building dense, but ADUs are going to follow something that's already there. And so that water and sewer will already be there to be tapped, perhaps with another connection. But it shouldn't cost the city any more money to put an ADU in one district versus another. I'm not seeing that.
Okay, so considering that we'd probably get additional tax revenue if you take the school component out,
Yes.
ADUs would have a net benefit
Anywhere.
regards to taxpayer burden. And then the other question I would have is, and this may be more for Councilor Denton, but ecologically speaking, ADUs should be a win, from almost all the environmental factors I can think of. Somebody living in an ADU versus a home in a new development somewhere else in town. It would be much better for global warming and things like that for them to choose an ADU.
Yes, if you do it right. If you do a bad ADU, no. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, the most efficient way to live is in a high-rise from an ecological standpoint. So there's a lot of ways you can live. These are small, single-family homes when they're detached. They're apartments when they're inside. So it again, will depend on the case, but I think most instances are going to meet that conclusion.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions from the council?
I did have one other point that Trevor did mention. We discussed this earlier today. The idea of allowing a certain category of 600 square foot units, I think, is important for the affordability goal of the council, because the current market, especially, if the minimum is 750, I think you're only going to see 750s. The market will drive people to build what they can, and it's going to cost more to do it, so they're going to ask more for rent, they're going to ask more for sale if they end up selling them, which with it as a package. But if you provide an avenue for smaller units, which are only very few, as we discussed, then I think you're providing additional opportunities for additional type of affordability. There's a 20% difference in square footage between 600 and 750. It's not insignificant. So, for your consideration, it's pure policy. I acknowledge that. So, but I just want you to be aware of that.
All right. We'll move to public comment. I think we've had a lot to consider through this work session. Compliments to the Land Use Committee for getting all the input up front. I would just add, from my own vantage point, we have input from people who already have houses. And we as a council also have to think about and represent people who need houses. So, public comment. Do we have a sign-up sheet? All right.
If I may, Counselor, if you're on Zoom and you wish to provide public comment, please raise your hand, and I'll let Counselor Tabor know you're interested in speaking.
We're going to go to the podium?
Yes. Sue, go ahead. We'll just go and line up as you need to.
Sue Polidura, Middle Street. Any of this, which mic? This one. I've been listening, and I just wanted to share this with you. It's kind of a little tongue-in-cheek kind of thing. I was looking at some all newspapers at the library, Portsmouth Herald, and I happened to come across this headline, and I said, "Oh, this is interesting." The workforce housing problems outlined at City Council meeting. City Planning Board to seek solutions. Dated January 1941. So I'm saying this just to say this is a problem that has been long in coming. It's not going to be solved overnight. I saw it come in the 1990s when a lot of people just couldn't afford anything and they were moving north to Somersworth and Rochester, and they just kept going north. It's not going to be solved overnight, and 2 or 3, 4 or 5 housing units is not going to solve it. This is a long-term issue. Just wanted to say that because you got to keep that in mind. Nothing that you do today or that you will do in the future is going to solve this. This is a matter of economics. So do the best you can. I just wanted to share this with you to see, that this problem has been around for a while. What solved this problem was December 7, 1941. Solved this problem because then we were at war and they put housing everywhere they could find a place to put it. And the federal government covered the cost because the population at the shipyard, working at the shipyard, went from, it just quadrupled almost overnight. And they needed a place to put all those families. So anyways, I found this. I thought it would be interesting bit of data to share. So
Thank you, Sue.
Good evening, Peter Huda, 280 South Street. We are here tonight reviewing the AD ordinance again. Even though some of us attended all of these meetings, and this was considered ready for the City Council approval. Councilor Bagley, 20 amendments. I counted them. To those of us who listened to Councilor Bagley at the 4-3 council meeting, and then had to go back and listen again. As City Councilor Bagley stated, the reason he did not participate in any of the numerous meetings on ADUs was due to the fact that he, as a city councilor who has been in office for 15 months, was confused by the right-to-know law and thought he would create a quorum because he was counting on the mayor as attending the meetings. Councilor Bagley's revelation here was enlightening and frightening. Councilor Bagley, had you researched the relevant New Hampshire RSAs 674-72 governing ADUs and city zoning ordinance, like those of us who had been working for months on this, we would not be here tonight. And the mayor obviously had other things to do. After months of meetings of discussion at the Land Use Committee, Land Use Board, numerous meetings, public and non-public, input from various public parties, including a $50,000 consultant, input from 3 planning board meetings, first reading at the City Council, public notice. Here we are, 20 amendments. Not to mention the dollars spent on staff time, legal department, Mr. Cracknell, who did a fantastic job tonight and at the rest of the meetings, considering the workload he was dealing with, and also Council Moreau. The city regulations that you deem unnecessary in your memo are all covered in the RSAs. 674, 72, number 1 to 10. Summarize what you deem unnecessary. Appears that you are saying this should be just a drop whatever you want and call it an ADU. No restrictions in height, size, massing, aesthetics, compliance, and consistency with the character of the existing neighborhoods in Portsmouth. For some of us who've attended all these meetings, this is very frustrating. Also, as discussed by Mr. Cracknell and the planning chair, most of the aesthetic descriptions in here are required for single-family homes. Those of us who had to go through the boards for all of that are very, I don't know what the word is, but it seems like you're misplacing the rest of us just to do this and complete some kind of assignment that you have. The other thing I'd like to address, Councilor Tabor.
3 minutes?
Yep. The other thing I'd like to address is the question that you asked on putting something by administrative approval in a backyard. There is something called due process for all the rest of the abutters. We are all abutters to somebody. And personally, and this was discussed in the first meeting, and Councilor Moreau will tell you this was my biggest pet peeve, that I do not want to wake up one morning and have a bulldozer in my backyard next door putting an ADU in without any notice. I am entitled as a property owner to due process. And that's what this gives everybody. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Greg Mahana of Aviation Avenue. This ordinance has been reviewed, edited, debated, and presented over the course of a year. Nick gave you an excellent summary this evening of the accomplishments. Now here we are tonight because one counselor, coincidentally one who was on the Land Use Committee but chose not to participate in the Land Use Committee, decided by submitting an email to the city manager on March 29th that he wants 17 changes in spite of never voicing any of these possible changes before March 29th. This should be considered a complete rewrite, and in legal terms, it's called substantial change. What that means is you can't pass it that way. It's got to go back to the planning board. These 17 changes are an insult to the people who have devoted their time to craft this revised ordinance. Councilor Bagley, I suggest you participate next time before you make these kind of changes at the last minute. Note to the council here, in the last 12 months, the Portsmouth Planning Board has approved 2 ADUs that were presented to the planning board by owners or builders with 0 professional help. No engineers, no lawyers, no nothing. It was approved with handwritten plans. Look up the minutes. I'm not making this up. This process isn't broken. It only requires modernization. This, over the last 12 months, is exactly what everybody has done, modernize the process. Here at the 13th hour, we don't need to rewrite it. Furthermore, as a Portsmouth landlord, additional housing will not change housing costs by $1. Housing in Portsmouth is priced per bedroom, period. This is whether it's an apartment in a multifamily, above a garage, in a backyard, or in a complex, or a detached ADU. Portsmouth demand exceeds supply because we are desirable. In closing, I remind the council that substantial changes, certainly 17 proposed amendments, require that the ordinance return to the planning board prior to city council contemplating any further action. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.
Liza Hewitt, Portsmouth. According to the ADU summary report of July 2022, there had been 37 ADUs approved and 15 built. The problem is not with the application process and the alleged restrictions of the ADU ordinance. The problem lies in what happens after they are approved and why they are not subsequently built. How do some members of the City Council equate ADUs with affordability? Where is the research that shows that when an ADU is built, it is rented at an affordable price? Councilor Bagley said at the April 3rd City Council meeting, quote, ADUs are the single best way to provide affordable housing in our city without affecting the taxpayer. Apparently, some members of the City Council believe that allowing ADUs to be built in any neighborhood in the city with little or no regulation is good for Portsmouth. Well, here's a little research. An ADU costing $300,000 to build using a residential loan at approximately 6% for 15 years would cost $2,531.57 monthly. If you add taxes, insurance, water and sewer, the rent would be close to $3,000 per month just to break even. ADUs are affordable if you are potentially weighing placing a family member in assisted living versus building an ADU. To build an ADU to place on the open rental market, the rent is probably not going to be affordable. Added to the cost of building the unit and the rent, you would need to charge to recoup your investment. Add the fact that now you need to be the landlord, with all of the headaches that come with that. And it becomes increasingly obvious why so few ADUs have been built in Portsmouth since 2017. However, with all of that said, in a process that took close to a year's time, the ordinance that has been presented to you this evening is the ordinance that you are being asked to approve. But wait, at the 11th hour comes Councilor Bagley with a proposed 20 changes to the ADU ordinance in the packet, which essentially guts the work done over the past year. Are you still proposing those 20 changes that were in the packet, Mr. Bagley? You did not show up for one single meeting, Councilor Bagley. I know, because I was at every single one of those, working with committee members and the planning department staff to craft a strong ADU ordinance, which I believe this is. I feel that ADUs have a place in Portsmouth, and while I don't agree with every standard in the proposed ordinance, I feel it is a good compromise for the city. How disrespectful, Mr. Bagley, of you to come here and propose to omit architectural standards and subordination standards in the proposed ordinance after a year of work by all who were involved. You could have brought your concerns to the Land Use Committee any time over the last year, in person or in writing. You didn't show up, Mr. Bagley, not for one meeting. You are very good at telling everyone else that they should listen to the experts. Well, there are plenty of experts involved over the past year, and you are not listening to any of them. I urge you, City Council, to pass the ADU ordinance to second reading as it was presented to the City Council at the first reading. And then, of course, with some of the legal changes, I understand.
We're at 3 minutes.
The ordinance is well crafted and is one that will work for all residents in the city, both ADU builders and ADU abutters. And I'd personally like to thank Nick Pracknell for his awesome work on this. I know how hard you've worked on this, and I really, really appreciate all you've done. Thank you.
Thank you, Liza.
We did, thank you. Counselor, while we're waiting, we have one hand on Zoom. You want to take that?
Sure, let's do that.
Esther Kennedy, please go ahead. Esther, you can unmute and go ahead. If you're speaking, we are not able to hear you.
It's on mute, though.
Should we go ahead to?
There, I think we heard you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, hi. This is Esther Kennedy, 41 Pickering Ave, Portsmouth. And I would just like to reiterate what I've just heard from many people. We have been at this for a long time. No, the city has been at it. The counselors that have sit on the committees have been involved. Many residents have attended. I've attended the ones I could attend. And we're at the 11th hour, and this has dropped on us. I heard tonight that we're really worried about housing in Portsmouth, and I don't disagree. However, I was really upset the other night when the council had an opportunity to make sure a developer followed the process and had housing, and they decided not to vote for it. So for counselors to sit there and say this ADU process and the reason we're not going to give public input on it is so that we can have more housing is ludicrous. They should have thought that last Monday night when they voted to give the developer the right of the way and took away some housing for Portsmouth. So I would hope that we can go forward with what everyone negotiated, and I was not in favor, I'm still not in favor of the whole plan. However, there's mediation involved, and that happens in a public process where people have input. So I would ask the council to move forward what was presented during the first and the beginning of second reading to the council and move that plan forward. And then if there's something down the road, you can always come back to it. But that was well worked on by many, many people in our community. And it's really sad that one or two counselors came forward in the end and wanted to upset and change everything. Thank you and have a good night.
Thank you, Esther.
Counselor, we also have Zelita Morgan on Zoom.
Okay, let's do that.
Go ahead, Zelita.
Hi, Councilman.
We are not able to hear you.
The work that between our living board.
Zelita, we're having trouble hearing you. Please mute your background and speak clearly.
Hold on. Can you hear me better?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to thank all involved, land use boards, residents for showing up and speaking on this topic. It's very important. Affordable housing is an issue. We know this is a regional issue. But Portsmouth, like one other resident spoke, is a desirable place to live. And if we believe that these ADUs are going to be affordable, they are not going to be. So I think if we are looking to, I'm going to throw something on the table. I think, number one, I really think this should move forward to second reading. The council should just move this forward. There has been months and months of work and good work and compromises made, and compromises are good. I hope you will honor that. So what I want to put on the table for consideration at another time is if we want to expedite, access to housing, and we want to make it affordable. And I heard Councilor Table talking about give home to people. I want to raise the point of keep people in their homes. So by allowing long-term rental in owner-occupied residences, so you are actually helping to create a space that will be more affordable, environmentally friendly, and helping a neighbor to stay and not create. So it's fast. I don't think it's, I don't see any hurdles or big hurdles on that, but just for consideration. I think it is important to discuss affordability on a regional scale, not only in Portsmouth. And I also believe that keeping your neighbors, keeping the character of our community, right, is important. And the character of our community is also the people who live here, our neighbors. So anyway, please move this forward. I hope you do. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zelita.
Good evening, Elizabeth Bratter, property owner, 159 McDonough Street. I want to thank Nick Cracknell and Ms. Moreau for guiding us and really working with everybody involved. There were a lot of different opinions going in a lot of different directions for all of this, and you did an excellent job, and I really appreciate it. I provided you with dimensions for the average apartments to look at total living space. That's just to give you an idea what you can do with 750 square feet, and you can do quite a bit. The cost of construction has pretty much doubled in the last 3 years, and to add an ADU, much less a DADU, will likely not provide low-income, much less workforce housing rental rates. It may provide some relief for retired members of the community to be able to afford rising tax expenses over time. But just think about this before you run out and go add an ADU because you want to save on taxes, is that your taxes will probably go up because you have an ADU. ADUs and DADUs are a great way for families to be able to keep mom or dad in their original home and provide a family member or a caregiver a place to live. The cost between assisted living and building an ADU would be significantly less. It may also be less than providing room and board for your college student, and you can turn your sons and daughters into your tenants if you can get them to pay rent. It may be something developers provide instead of a rumpus room over a garage when they're building new homes. Updating accessory dwelling units in the city's ordinance was really necessary. I talked to a few engineers about this, and many of them said to me that Portsmouth has some of the better ordinances regarding that, but they were still very confusing and they really needed more guidelines. Accessory dwelling units can be added just by administrative approval or providing notice to the neighbors is a great idea. The opportunity to add them with the conditional use permit is also a great idea, allowing for some of the existing variations on many properties. Ultimately, the changes presented today by the Planning Department, provided by the Land Use Committee, which brought together surveys, public input, brainstorming, pitfall reflections, and ways to produce best outcomes, should be approved as written. These were approved by the Planning Board, and what are before you today for review are the best combinations of existing ordinances, new ideas, protections for direct abutters, protections for those who want to build them, and protections for entire neighborhoods. Many loopholes have been closed and expectations have been clearly defined to aid in understanding the process. Please do not throw out the baby with the bathwater. If extra new units are added to a piece of property, more parking is always needed. Many of these areas where these units can be built already have parking issues, and if you want to annoy neighbors, just add another unit to your building so you can take more parking spaces on the road. As can be seen on the total living space flyer that I gave you, a lot can be done with 750 square units. The Land Use Committee was available for letters, public comments for weeks on this subject via Zoom, email, or in person. There were planning board meetings where public comment could be made as well. The hours of work that went into updating the ordinances to meet what the City Council asked for, the input that was provided by many to create what RSA 674-72 and its accompanying regulations required, was made easier and clearer for the citizens to use. Please approve these ordinances as they stand. I believe there is something wiped out. I noticed on 1018.32 and 1018.41.
We're at 3 minutes.
That 2 bedrooms were marked off, and I believe, Nick, you said 2 bedrooms are in. So I just want to make sure that gets checked off. And remember, the reasons we have ordinances today is because neighbors are not self-regulating. Neighbors do what they want, and if their neighbors get mad about it, too bad. So don't expect neighbors to watch out for each other. It doesn't necessarily work the way we want. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz.
Good evening, Councilor Tabor, ladies and gentlemen. Paige Trace, 27 Hancock Street. I'm here tonight not because I went to every meeting like some of the invested residents did here. I'm here tonight to personally say thank you to Councilor Moreau, to Mr. Tabor, your also your senior planner, Mr. Cracknell. Counselor Tabor, I do somewhat take exception to you saying that every time someone gets up or somebody goes to a meeting that they're speaking out because they're against something. They aren't. There are residents in this room today who spent hundreds of hours. So I'm just here simply to say thank you to those invested residents of this city who thought enough. Every morning there was a land use committee meeting that took time out of Councilor Moreau's morning, but she was invested enough to be there along with Nick Cracknell and other people in this room. And they went to those meetings and they worked on ADUs. They worked on the best process possible and a modernization of something that was probably, some would term, archaic. So I'm here simply to say thank you to those people tonight. It's the reason I came. And I'm here to say to Councilor Bagley, who never showed up to a meeting, why? Why did you think that you could simply just say that it might be a quorum issue when it wasn't? There were, how can you do this? How can you bring 20 plus changes to something that people worked so hard on? There were experts working on it. And I realize you'd like to change the aesthetics, but frankly, those aesthetics are a roadmap to get people to the end result quicker. So while you're so busy trying to cut them out or the parking, maybe you should listen to Councilor Moreau, or listen to the head of the planning department, or listen to the city manager or the senior planning developer, because they all actually are experts and they know. So I'll put my faith in them next time. And thank you, Councilor Moreau, for all the time you put in and everybody you listened to. God bless you.
Thank you, Paige. Anybody else for public comment? All right. No more public comment. I'll close that part of the meeting. And if there are no other questions or comments or discussion, we'll wait for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.